A1.1 The Americas. If you picture the Americas in 1491 as an empty stage awaiting Europeans, you miss the reality. Across vast distances, people farmed, traded, built cities, organized governments, and explained the universe through powerful religious traditions. The same core human challenges appeared everywhere: feeding populations, organizing authority, managing conflict, creating meaning. But geography pushed societies toward different solutions. Fertile lowlands with rivers encouraged certain patterns. High mountains and thin air demanded others. Looking closely at the Olmec, Maya, Aztec, Inca, and the many native nations of North America reveals both shared patterns and tremendous diversity long before sustained European contact. The first Americans. The Olmec Mesoamerica, stretching from central Mexico into parts of Central America, offers some of the earliest evidence of large-scale, complex societies in the region. On the humid Gulf Coast lowlands of present-day Mexico, river networks supported the Olmec, roughly 1200–400 BCE. Early doesn't mean simplistic. It means they left especially clear evidence of social and political organization, evidence that later societies would echo, revise, and adapt in their own ways. That complexity is visible in planned ceremonial centers, spaces designed for ritual, public gathering, and authority, rather than everyday residence. Monumental platforms and carefully arranged plazas imply coordinated labor and centralized decision-making, which usually points to leadership able to mobilize people and resources, and, as a result, to social hierarchy. You can see specialization as well: artisans producing skilled crafts, priests managing rituals and sacred calendars, and rulers or elites claiming authority and living differently from most farmers. Specialization depends on productive agriculture because food surpluses allow some people to focus on roles beyond constant farming. Geography helps explain why this developed on the Gulf Coast. Fertile soils supported population growth, while rivers and coastal access acted as transportation corridors for goods and ideas. Long-distance trade doesn't only move objects, it links communities into networks where styles, religious symbols, and political practices circulate. The Olmec participated in exchange systems, moving valued materials across regions, and those networks accelerated cultural interaction and change. The most famous Olmec legacy, the colossal stone heads, makes organization visible. Quarrying, transporting, and carving massive stone requires planning, skilled labor, and leadership. These monuments likely served political and religious ends, perhaps depicting powerful rulers. Alongside them, monumental architecture and recurring imagery point to ritual systems and symbols that appear again in later Mesoamerican traditions. It's best to think of the Olmec not as the single inventor of Mesoamerican civilization, but as an influential participant in a long regional conversation. That distinction matters because it corrects a common misconception. First does not mean the only origin. Mesoamerican development was less a single trunk and more a braided river, multiple societies innovating, borrowing, competing, and adapting. The Olmec were one major strand in a dynamic region. The Maya. If the Olmec show early complexity, the Maya show how far complexity could develop in city life and knowledge systems. The Maya region spanned the Yucatan Peninsula and parts of present-day Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, forests, lowlands, and highlands. That varied geography shaped politics. Rather than forming one empire, the Maya organized into many competing city-states, each with its own ruling family and elite class, seeking resources, allies, and prestige. Because there was no single emperor, Maya power centered on local kingship, lineage, and religion. Rulers justified authority by tying themselves to sacred history through ancestral descent and divine connections, and they sponsored public rituals that made legitimacy visible. It helps to drop the modern assumption that religion and politics are separate. For the Maya, temples, ceremonies, and ritual calendars were part of political life, an important language of authority. Warfare and alliances among city-states were strategic contests for influence, tribute, captives, and status, not random violence. Maya achievements in writing and mathematics supported this political religious world. Their glyphic writing recorded names, events, and dynastic histories. Mathematics and astronomy enabled precise calendrical systems, crucial for both agriculture and ritual timing. When multiple calendars track sacred cycles, solar years, and historical time, record-keeping becomes a form of power. Elites present themselves as guardians of cosmic order through scheduled ritual and documented history. These systems rested on a strong economy. Intensive maize-based agriculture supported cities, specialists, and elites. And maize was not just food, it was identity and religion, embedded in origin stories and daily survival. Trade moved staples and luxury goods, and merchants carried information as well as products. Tribute funneled goods toward elites and temples, reinforcing hierarchy in ways that show up across world history. Even the Maya collapse needs careful wording. The decline was uneven and regional. Many major southern lowland centers lost population. Some cities were abandoned, and political systems fractured. But Maya communities continued elsewhere, and Maya descendants remain today. Collapse describes the breakdown of certain city-states and arrangements, not the disappearance of a people or culture. The Aztec. From the Maya city-state world, it's a useful shift to the Aztec, who call themselves the Mexica, because they built a more centralized empire rapidly through conquest and tribute. Centered on Tenochtitlan in the Valley of Mexico, their expansion in the 1400s created an imperial system tying many subject peoples to the capital. Tenochtitlan was a major urban hub with markets, temples, and dense neighborhoods, an engine that demanded food, labor, and goods from across the region. Aztec rule relied on conquest and tribute. Defeated communities often kept local leaders but owed regular payments, food, textiles, luxury items, and other resources. Expansion was organized through the Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, though Tenochtitlan became dominant. Tribute enriched the capital, but it also produced resentment among subject peoples. Environmental engineering helped sustain that imperial power. In lake-filled areas, the Aztecs developed chinampas, highly productive agricultural plots built up in shallow waters, often called floating gardens, though not literally floating. Constant moisture and nutrient-rich soils increased yields, supporting dense urban life and military expansion. Causeways and related infrastructure connected the city to the mainland, enabling movement of people and goods. Engineering here isn't a side detail. It is the material base of the empire. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined. Ritual and warfare reinforced authority. War gained territory and tribute, and it also produced captives used in ceremonies expressing the state's relationship to the gods and cosmic order. In their worldview, these practices were tied to sustaining the world and demonstrating rulers' legitimacy as caretakers of balance between human society and the divine. The tribute system, though, created a structural weakness. When extraction is widespread, goods, labor, autonomy, internal tensions build. Empires often rise or fall not only from external threats, but from how unified or fractured they are internally when outsiders arrive. The Inca. If the Aztecs show conquest in a dense valley, the Inca show what organization and infrastructure can accomplish in extreme terrain. Centered at Cusco in the Andes, by the late 1400s, the Inca built the largest empire in the Americas. The Andes pose obvious challenges: mountains, deep valleys, high plateaus, and sharp climate shifts by elevation. So governing required solutions to distance and diversity. The Inca relied on centralized rule and a managed provincial system. They integrated many peoples through loyal administrators, cooperation with local intermediaries, and at times resettlement policies that relocated populations. Resettlement could weaken local power bases and reduce rebellion while also spreading skills and tightening imperial control. Integration often meant deliberate state planning over people's lives. Infrastructure held the empire together. An extensive road network and bridges enabled communication, troop movement, and transport across rugged terrain. Roads are administrative tools. Faster messengers mean quicker enforcement and quicker response to crises. Along these routes, state storehouses held food and supplies. In a region where harvests vary by altitude and weather, storage becomes power, feeding armies, supporting public projects, and managing shortages. The Inca economy can feel unfamiliar because it did not depend on money markets like many European societies. Instead, the state relied on labor taxation, the mait'a. Communities owed labor time rather than coins. That labor built roads, farmed state lands, served in the military, and constructed imperial works. In return, people received forms of support such as food, protection, festival participation, and access to land within the system. It's a different method for the same state problem, how to mobilize resources for large collective projects. Geography again drove innovation. The Inca mastered terrace farming, carving mountain steps to create flat plots that reduced erosion and managed water. They also exploited vertical ecological tiers by growing different crops at different elevations, maize lower, potatoes higher, grazing higher still, spreading risk and diversifying diets. The Andes forced creativity, and the Inca turned that creativity into imperial strength. Native Americans moving north, the key concept is diversity. North America included hundreds of distinct nations with different languages, political forms, spiritual practices, and economic systems. Treating Native Americans as one culture is like treating Europeans as a single people. A central analytical skill is regional adaptation. Environment shapes lifeways, but it does not mechanically determine them. In fertile areas with long growing seasons, many communities developed agriculture and permanent towns. Elsewhere, hunting and fishing dominated, with seasonal movement to follow herds or fish runs. Often the best description is mixed economies that combine farming, hunting, fishing, and foraging. This variation is not less development. It reflects choices matched to local realities. Governance varied just as much. Some groups organized in smaller, decentralized bands with flexible leadership based on skill, persuasion, or kinship. Others formed confederacies that coordinated defense, diplomacy, and shared decisions. Many emphasized consensus and kinship networks rather than monarchies. Consensus-based governance is not disorder. It is a different model of legitimacy grounded in relationships, obligations, and collective agreement. Long before Europeans, continuity and connection came through oral traditions that preserved history and values, diplomatic practices that managed alliances and conflicts, and trade routes moving goods across long distances. These societies were not isolated. They navigated complex intergroup relationships, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, through negotiation and change. One misconception is especially persistent. Native peoples were not uniformly nomadic. Many were settled agriculturalists with complex political systems. Mobility often reflected strategic responses to seasonal resources, not lack of structure. And settlement does not automatically mean empire. The core story is variety, multiple ways to build community, authority, and survival. Native peoples of the Eastern Woodland. The Eastern Woodland, east of the Mississippi, including the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, and Atlantic forests, shows adaptation in a concrete way. Rich forests, abundant waterways, and growing seasons that often supported agriculture encouraged diverse, flexible economies. Where multiple reliable food sources exist, communities can develop strategies that absorb bad harvests and shifting conditions. Subsistence commonly blended farming with hunting, fishing, and foraging. The three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, capture ecological knowledge. Maize provides a stalk, beans restore nitrogen, and squash spreads to reduce weeds and retain moisture. Seasonal cycles also shaped settlement. Communities might anchor life in villages for farming and social organization while moving seasonally for hunting, fishing, or gathering key resources. Social and political life often centered on villages and towns organized by kinship and clan systems, frameworks for identity, obligation, and decision-making. Diplomacy mattered because neighbors could be trading partners in one season and rivals in another. Managing relationships could be as crucial as managing crops. In some areas, confederacies coordinated multiple groups for mutual security and influence, while trade and alliances helped maintain stability in a densely populated region. Technology and culture reflected the landscape. Woodworking supported housing, tools, and watercraft, and canoes turned rivers into transportation corridors that connected communities. In some societies, longhouses housed extended families and expressed social organization, architecture as social structure. Ceremonial traditions linked to harvest cycles reinforced shared responsibility. When agriculture anchors life, the fields become a community concern, shaping rituals that bind people together. All of this matters because it prevents a simple before and after story once Europeans appear. Societies with established diplomacy, alliance building, and military strategy would not merely react. They would make calculated choices shaped by their own interests and rivalries. After 1492, contact unfolds within already complex political landscapes, empires in Mesoamerica and the Andes, and diverse nations across North America, and that complexity shapes what encounters actually look like on the ground. B. 1.2 Europe on the brink of change. Life. In feudal Europe. A few centuries before 1492, most of Europe did not look like modern countries with firm borders and centralized governments. It looked like land, fields, forests, mills, pasture, because land was the main source of wealth and survival. That is what feudalism and manorialism describe, a land-based social and economic order built on obligations. A lord controlled an estate and traded protection for loyalty and service. Vassals, often nobles, owed military support, arriving with horses, armor, and trained fighting skills when summoned. Peasants and serfs did most agricultural labor, producing the grain and livestock that fed everyone, and their work was less a job than a set of duties tied to the land. On many manors, serfs could not freely leave, and rights and responsibilities were inherited, so a person's life path was often set early. This hierarchy shaped expectations. Nobles and knights were trained for war and were supposed to fight, keep order, and defend the community, at least in theory. The clergy handled the sacred side of life, worship, education, and interpreting suffering or good fortune. Peasants and serfs kept the system running, and in a pre-industrial world, food production dominated time and labor. A bad harvest was not a minor setback. It could mean hunger, disease, and death. Mobility existed. Someone might enter the church, or a successful merchant family might rise. But for most people, the system was sticky, born into a rank, likely to die there. Power was intensely local. A castle or manor house was not only a home, it was a political center, storage site, defensive structure, and symbol of authority. When danger threatened, people did not expect a distant national army. They ran to the lord's walls. Law and justice were often local too, so political control was fragmented compared to later nation-states. That fragmentation matters because large coordinated projects, like fleets and long voyages, are hard to organize and fund when authority and wealth are scattered. At the same time, Europe was not static. Towns grew where trade concentrated, river crossings, coasts, crossroads. As trade expanded, money became more useful than goods like grain because coin is portable. A money economy did not replace land quickly, but it loosened the assumption that wealth mainly comes from fields. New groups gained influence: merchants, bankers, and guild-organized artisans. They did not fit neatly into the older "those who fight, those who pray, those who work the land" model. As towns accumulated wealth, monarchs saw a path to power that depended less on bargaining with local nobles. Taxing trade and controlling ports could strengthen kings and queens more reliably than feudal loyalty alone. Over time, that shift made overseas exploration imaginable and then achievable. As monarchies consolidated, rulers could think beyond feudal constraints. Wealth became something that could be collected, stored, and deployed for big goals: armies, palaces, and eventually voyages. A ruler who can marshal taxes, ships, and skilled navigators is no longer trapped in purely local logic. Europe did not suddenly get curious. It built political and economic tools that made acting on ambition practical. The Church and Society. In a fragmented political world, the Catholic Church mattered because it provided a kind of unity across borders that many kingdoms could not. Latin Christian beliefs and practices created shared rituals and shared authority from village parishes to cathedrals to Rome. The Church was not only private faith. It educated many of the people who were educated at all, trained clergy who could read and write, and preserved records that governments later relied on. Tracking marriages, births, deaths, property transfers, and oaths was easier when the Church made those events legible and enforceable. In daily life, the Church shaped time and meaning. Sacraments like baptism, marriage, and last rites structured community belonging and salvation. The calendar revolved around holy days and festivals, and illness or disaster was often interpreted spiritually. Plague as a call to repentance, crop failure as punishment or warning. Monasteries were not just places of prayer. They preserved texts, copied manuscripts, and served as centers of charity, hospitality, and basic care, combining roles that in later societies might be spread across libraries, schools, and social services. That influence created stability, but it also created pressure. When one institution shapes so much of life, disagreement becomes intense. Critiques of corruption circulated long before 1492, wealthy clergy, political maneuvering, leaders who seemed far from humble ideals. Debates also simmered about authority and salvation, who interprets Scripture, which rituals matter, what a good Christian life requires. These were not yet the Reformation, but they were stress lines ready to widen. Contact with the Americas later introduced questions that challenged a biblical framework many Europeans assumed was universal. Meeting peoples who had never heard of Christianity raised difficult issues. If salvation comes through Christ, what about those who never had the chance to accept or reject the message? Some argued native peoples must be condemned. Others argued that ignorance was not rejection, and that Christian duty required teaching, not assuming damnation. Even animals became puzzles. If all animals descend from those saved on Noah's Ark, how do llamas, turkeys, and other unfamiliar species fit, especially on lands unknown to biblical geography? These questions did not topple the Church overnight, but they chipped at confidence that the inherited map of knowledge was complete. Chronology helps keep the picture accurate. Before 1492, Europe's religious structure remained powerful and widely trusted, even with criticism. The Reformation begins in 1517 after Columbus and had its own political, theological, and economic causes. Still, post-1492 discoveries and debates added fuel to a broader climate of questioning. The world got bigger, and it became harder for any single institution to claim it already had every answer. Christianity encounters. Islam Europe also did not develop inside a sealed Christian bubble. For centuries, Christian and Muslim societies interacted around the Mediterranean, sometimes violently, sometimes practically, sometimes even cooperatively. Trade moved spices, textiles, metals, and luxury goods through ports where languages mixed, and diplomacy mattered because rivals still negotiated over prisoners, borders, safe passage, and commerce. Warfare and fear were real, but the relationship cannot be reduced to constant conflict. People met in markets as well as on battlefields. Later, European narratives often portrayed Islam as a constant unified threat, but history is messier. Regions differed, and tolerance and persecution appeared on multiple sides at different times. In some periods under Muslim rule, Jews and Christians could worship with protections that look striking compared with what minorities faced in some Christian kingdoms. The point is not to label one side as good and the other as bad, but to notice how selective memory works. Groups remember what supports fear and forget what complicates it. You can see that selectivity in a simple contrast. Turks and Moors sometimes permitted Jews and Christians to practice their faith at times when European Christians were torturing, expelling, or otherwise persecuting Jews and Muslims. Once you notice that, identity building becomes easier to spot. Communities often simplify the past, highlighting conflict, downplaying coexistence, to make later decisions feel natural or necessary. These interactions also mattered in practical terms. The Mediterranean functioned as a commercial highway, and control of routes shaped who got rich. Europeans wanted Asian goods, spices, silk, porcelain, not merely for luxury. Spices preserved food and signaled status. Luxury goods displayed power. If access depends on intermediaries who control key choke points, Europeans have incentives to seek alternatives. Competition over routes did not automatically cause exploration, but it created long-term pressure. When old roads are expensive or politically risky, new routes become more attractive. European voyages make more sense when you remember that Europe had long been trading with, fighting with, and learning from other religious cultures. Exploration was not Europe waking up to the world. It was an attempt to reposition within a world Europeans already knew extended beyond their borders. Jerusalem and the Crusades. The Crusades show how tightly religion, politics, and economics can tangle. Beginning in 1095, a series of wars were launched under Christian religious framing, aimed at Jerusalem and other contested regions. Many participants genuinely believed they fought for sacred duty. At the same time, nobles sought prestige, land, and influence, and merchants saw opportunities in routes and markets. Treating the Crusades as purely religious misses power and profit. Treating them as purely economic misses how spiritual language motivated action and shaped identity. Mixed motives are normal in history. Within Europe, crusading helped shift power. Monarchs who styled themselves defenders of the faith gained prestige, and in a feudal world, prestige could become leverage over nobles. Participation also reshuffled property. Nobles sometimes sold land or mortgaged estates to fund campaigns, which could strengthen kings and enrich lenders and merchants. Trade networks expanded as Europeans became more familiar with Eastern goods and routes. Even when crusading armies failed militarily, contacts still shaped European appetites and ambitions. The Crusades also intensified religious hostility. Violence sometimes turned inward against Jewish communities in Europe, made scapegoats during heightened zeal. That matters because wars framed as external can redraw internal boundaries of belonging. Persecution can become part of how communities define themselves under pressure. Yet cross-cultural exchange continued in the middle of conflict. Armies required supply lines, translators, maps, and local knowledge. Merchants followed soldiers, and soldiers returned with stories and objects. Knowledge and technology moved through Mediterranean contact, navigation techniques, mathematical ideas, medical texts, new foods, and fabrics. One recurring irony is that conflict can increase contact, and contact can increase borrowing. This background connects to later exploration. If crusading contact deepened desire for Eastern goods while sharpening rivalries over who controlled routes, a dream emerges. Reach Asia without intermediaries, bypass political and commercial choke points. That logic did not force anyone onto ships, but it made the gamble feel worth taking, especially as monarchies gained the capacity to sponsor it. The Iberian Peninsula. These forces came into sharp focus in the Iberian Peninsula, today's Spain and Portugal. Iberia was a frontier zone where Christian and Muslim societies interacted for centuries through war, coexistence, and exchange. Life on that edge-shaped political culture, linking religious identity to territorial control while building practical experience in navigation, trade, and negotiating with neighboring powers. By the late 1400s, state formation in Iberia advanced in ways crucial for the Atlantic world. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon helped create a more unified Spain, and consolidation increased centralized authority. State building requires predictable taxes, loyal officials, and a unified public identity, and in Iberia, that project became tightly bound to religious unity and expansion. The year 1492 captures that intersection with unusual clarity. Under Isabella and Ferdinand, Spain conquered Granada, the last major Muslim stronghold, completing the long Christian reconquest. That same year, Spain expelled its Jewish population, uprooting families who had lived in Iberia for generations. It shows how unity can be pursued through exclusion and coercion. It also sets up a revealing contrast. Ottoman Turkish realms accepted some Jews expelled from Spain. The point is not to romanticize anyone, but to see that minority policies differed, and those differences shaped where people fled, how skills and knowledge moved, and how societies remembered one another. Iberia became the launch point for Atlantic exploration because it had both motive and means. Portugal, linked to Prince Henry the Navigator, invested in sailing technology, mapping, and voyages down the African coast, building experience in open ocean navigation. Spain, newly unified and eager to compete, funded Columbus. Strategy mattered as much as curiosity. If Mediterranean and overland routes to Asian goods were contested, expensive, or threatened by shifting control, sailing around obstacles became appealing. The ocean meant risk and possibility. Once Spanish and Portuguese voyages produced claims, rivalry followed. States compete not only with weapons, but with maps and legal arguments. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, tried to manage that rivalry by dividing claims between Spain and Portugal along an imaginary line, assigning spheres of conquest and exploration. It can sound absurd, drawing a line on lands not yet seen, but it fits the pattern. Stronger monarchies, backed by religious authority, using law and diplomacy to channel economic ambition. The treaty shows Europe acting increasingly like states capable of projecting power outward, beyond local feudal limits. By 1492, Europe stood on a threshold. Feudal life remained local and landbound, but towns and money were widening horizons. The Church still unified belief and routine, even as criticism and questions accumulated, and discoveries after 1492 would intensify them. Centuries of contact with Islam had taught Europeans to view the wider world through rivalry and exchange. The Crusades mixed sacred purpose with material desire, expanding trade and sharpening the urge to bypass intermediaries. Iberia, shaped by frontier conflict and rapid consolidation, developed both the will and capacity to push into the Atlantic. C. 1.3 West Africa and the role of slavery. The major African empires. If the Americas remind us that large organized societies existed long before Europeans, West Africa should feel familiar in the same useful way. Europeans did not arrive at an empty coastline. They reached a region already linked by rivers, caravan routes, ports, and diplomacy, to powerful inland states, states with governments, armies, courts, and cities where people debated religion and law, studied texts, and built wealth through long-distance trade. West African imperial power rested heavily on geography, but not as a vague, they had resources claim. The Sahel, the belt just south of the Sahara, sat at a hinge between North Africa and the forest and river zones farther south. For centuries, camel caravans crossed the desert, moving goods and ideas in both directions. Rulers who could protect routes, enforce rules, and keep order made trade safer. Merchants then accepted taxes and fees as the price of security. One of the quiet engines of empire is that a state does not need to mine all the gold itself if it can regulate and tax the people transporting it. Ghana is often introduced first and remembered as a gold empire, which is true but easy to oversimplify. Its strength came from controlling exchange between regions producing different high-value goods, gold moving north from the south, salt moving south from the Sahara, and textiles and manufactured items circulating through the same networks. Salt mattered because in hot climates without refrigeration, it is essential for health and food preservation, so a reliable supply could shape whether cities thrive. Add kola nuts, widely traded and culturally important, and the picture looks less like primitive barter and more like a complex commercial system with specialists, established routes, and long-distance merchants. As power shifted from Ghana to Mali and then Songhai, there was continuity alongside change. Dynasties and borders moved, but the underlying structure remained. Trans-Saharan trade, the Niger River as a commercial corridor, states building authority by managing commerce, and cities growing where trade and learning concentrated. It also helps to remember that names like Ghana and Mali refer to political formations that changed over time, not fixed modern nation-states. Mali provides a clear anchor through Sundiata Keita. In the early 1200s, he is remembered as a foundational leader who unified groups and helped establish Mali as Ghana's influence weakened. Mali's rise was not automatic. It took political work. A successful state had to make roads safer than rivals could, settle disputes predictably, and defend territory with real force. With stability, Mali could attract commerce, tax it, and use that revenue to strengthen administration and armies, making trade safer and reinforcing the cycle. As Mali expanded, Islam becomes essential to understand, not as a uniform identity everyone shared, but as a bridge into broader networks of trade and learning across North Africa and beyond. As merchants and scholars traveled, Islamic institutions and education traveled too. For rulers, adopting Islam could bring practical advantages: shared legal ideas for contracts, trusted ties with Muslim merchants, and wider diplomatic legitimacy. At the same time, local beliefs did not simply disappear. Religious life often became layered, with communities and elites adopting Islam in different ways. These connections are especially vivid in cities like Timbuktu. It is often treated as mythical, but it was a strategic working city near the Niger River, tied to routes crossing the Sahara. Timbuktu became more than a market because wealth and scholarship supported each other. Trade created demand for literacy, accounts, contracts, correspondence. Rulers relied on jurists and scholars for law and governance. Students and teachers gathered where patrons funded schools and libraries. Timbuktu and other centers became known for Islamic scholarship and for manuscripts that were copied, studied, and debated. The manuscript tradition matters because it shows sustained intellectual life, ideas preserved, argued over, and transmitted across generations. Songhai, rising in the 1400s and into the 1500s, continued this pattern of state building around commerce and territorial control. The Niger River functioned like an interior highway, moving people and goods. Songhai expanded military and administrative reach, and cities like Gao and Timbuktu became part of an empire capable of projecting authority over long distances. The storyline, then, is not Europe arrives, Africa begins. It is that Africa already had sophisticated political economies, and Europeans later inserted themselves into that world. That point becomes a hinge for what follows. When Europeans explored the West African coast in the 1400s, they encountered established commercial and diplomatic systems. African rulers and merchants already had experience negotiating, trading, and defending interests. Europeans brought maritime technology and new goals, but they still had to operate within existing networks. Early on, they were often one more set of traders seeking access to profitable exchanges, not instant rulers of the region. The role of slavery. To understand what changes after Atlantic contact, it's necessary to face a difficult but crucial fact. Slavery existed in many African societies before 1492. If that reality is ignored, the later Atlantic slave trade can seem to appear from nowhere. But stopping at slavery existed also misleads, because African systems of slavery varied widely and were not the same institution that later developed in the Americas. In many parts of West Africa, people could be enslaved through warfare, debt, punishment for certain offenses, or capture in raids linked to political conflict. Slavery was therefore often tied to power and instability. As states expanded or rivals fought, captives could become a source of wealth and labor. Enslaved people might work in households, agriculture, or other labor supporting elite status and production. In some societies, rulers also used enslaved labor to strengthen the state itself, including military or administrative roles that tied individuals directly to the ruler. At the same time, enslaved did not always mean the same social reality everywhere. In the later Atlantic world, especially plantation colonies, slavery became increasingly racialized, hereditary, and chattel-based, with people treated as property for life, children inheriting enslaved status, and law and culture hardening slave versus free into a racial boundary. In many African contexts before 1492, the boundary could be harsh and coercive, yet sometimes more socially porous. In certain places and periods, enslaved people could marry, hold property, earn or be granted freedom, or become integrated into households or communities over time. None of this makes slavery humane. It shows that the institution's structure and long-term social meaning could differ from what later emerges in the Americas. A concrete way to see the difference is to ask what happens to the child of an enslaved person. In plantation systems, the legal answer became brutally fixed. The child is enslaved, tied to a racial category colonists define and enforce. In some earlier African systems, the answer might vary by local law, household practice, circumstances of enslavement, or time. That flexibility is not safety, but it can make slavery function more like a spectrum of unfreedom rather than a locked, inherited caste. This difference helps explain how supply could expand once outside demand surged. If conflict and captivity already produced enslaved laborers, then anything that increases warfare, raiding, or state competition can increase bondage. Even before the Atlantic system reaches full scale, slavery in some places was connected to politics and production, and leaders might treat enslaved people as both labor and trade goods. Add a new market, European buyers offering goods and seeking profit, and incentives intensify inside an existing uneven system, reshaping politics quickly. Timeline matters, so the transformation is not imagined as instantaneous. Portuguese exploration along the West African coast begins in the 1400s, and Europeans participated in slave trading early. But large-scale transatlantic expansion accelerates in the early 1500s, often dated around 1525, as the trade grows significantly. That shift is central. Slavery existed before, but the scale and destination were about to change dramatically. The Atlantic world created demand not just for coerced labor, but for enormous, continuous labor forces for colonial plantations and extractive economies. Sugar cultivation in particular became an economic machine that consumed labor. Once colonies committed to that model, they required a steady, coerced workforce. One misconception is worth correcting carefully. The fact that some African leaders and merchants participated in slavery and slave trading does not mean West Africa was uniformly a slave society, as if everyone agreed, benefited equally, or built their entire economy around it. West African societies were diverse, with different states, labor systems, and moral and religious debates about bondage. Participation also does not mean the Atlantic outcome was simply an African choice or a straightforward extension of earlier practices. European colonial labor demands, shipping capacity, investment, and the creation of racial ideologies in the Americas transformed slavery's scale, permanence, and brutality. In the Atlantic system, slavery became more standardized in violence and more permanent in law because it was engineered to serve plantation economies and imperial competition. So when you ask how and why the transatlantic slave trade expanded, you are looking at an intersection. West Africa had established states and trade networks that could be negotiated with and later manipulated, and it had forms of slavery that could be exploited as a labor source. Europe brought new incentives tied to colonization, profit, and plantation agriculture in the Americas. When these pieces locked together, the human consequences were staggering, and the history of the Americas cannot be understood without seeing how this Atlantic system was constructed from older, already complex worlds. Closing concepts. Understanding the Americas, Europe, and West Africa before 1492 prevents a Europe-centered origin story and shows that Europeans entered a world of already complex societies, trade networks, and belief systems. If American history starts at 1492, it can sound as if the Americas were an empty stage and Europeans brought history with them. That is inaccurate, and it also makes later events harder to explain because Europeans did not arrive in a vacuum. They entered a world already shaped by political rivalries, economic systems, religious commitments, and long-distance connections. It is more accurate to treat 1492 as a meeting point, not a starting line, because the cause and effect of what follows becomes clearer. Contact was not just a ship landing, it linked regions that had developed separately for thousands of years. Each region had its own ways of producing food, organizing government, building wealth, and explaining the world through belief. Once connected, a chain reaction followed. Goods moved, people moved, ideas moved, and so did germs. Like connecting ecosystems long kept apart, the moment the barrier opened, things spread both ways. The shock was not that one side had history and the other did not. It was that powerful societies with different technologies, diseases, economies, and political goals suddenly collided and became entangled. Trade makes that visible immediately. Before 1492, American societies traded across long distances, luxury goods, tools, and food, through regional networks, even without a single global market linking them to Europe and Africa. Europe and West Africa also had established systems tying towns, kingdoms, and empires together, including trans-Saharan trade and Mediterranean commerce. Atlantic travel did not invent trade. It rerouted and intensified existing exchange and added new incentives to old patterns. As you study the Columbian Exchange later, it helps to remember that exchange is never only about objects. It is also about power, who controls routes, who sets terms, who profits, and who bears the costs. Belief systems mattered just as much. Europeans brought more than ships and weapons. They brought a worldview shaped by Christianity and by centuries of Christian-Muslim encounters around the Mediterranean and in Iberia. Native peoples were not blank slates either. Spiritual traditions were embedded in politics, agriculture, calendars, and community life, shaping how leaders interpreted strangers, alliances, and threats. West African societies likewise combined Islamic learning in some regions with other religious traditions tied to law, education, and authority. After contact, religion became part of diplomacy, conquest, and resistance, used to justify expansion, to interpret danger, and to negotiate with foreign powers. If faith is treated as decoration, a real driver of decisions disappears from view. Disease may be the most misunderstood factor because it can seem like an accidental side story. It was not. After centuries of separation, disease became one of the most powerful differences between regions. Eurasians lived long-term with domesticated animals and dense settlements, conditions that helped certain diseases evolve and circulate. Many native communities had large cities and complex societies, but they had not faced the same set of old-world pathogens over centuries. When contact occurred, that biological gap became historical change. Conquest, labor systems, migration, and the collapse or transformation of communities cannot be explained without keeping disease near the center. Taken together, this changes what kind of story you tell. A Europe-centered origin story can make later outcomes look inevitable, as if Europeans were destined to take over. A more accurate story is more contingent. Europeans entered a world of strong societies and existing networks, and what followed was an unstable, unequal connection among powerful regions with different strengths and vulnerabilities. That approach is not only broader, it makes the next lessons make sense. Hold the Americas, Europe, and West Africa in view at the same time, and development stops looking like a single ladder. It is more like different toolkits shaped by environment and history. In the Americas, it helps to picture large states. The Aztec Empire centered on Tenochtitlan, an island capital drawing food and tribute into an urban core. The Inca Empire along the Andes, unified by roads, storehouses, and labor obligations that moved resources across mountains. And the Maya, not a single empire in 1492, but a civilization of sophisticated city-states with major architecture and intellectual traditions, including complex calendars and writing. The point is not to tally advanced traits, but to recognize that these societies faced real governing problems and built real solutions: taxation, logistics, legitimacy, alliances, and conflict. At the same time, the Americas were never only empires. North America included many societies well adapted to local conditions. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon abundance supported dense populations and systems where wealth was displayed and redistributed through ceremonies. In the Southwest, irrigation and farming in dry climates shaped settlement and cooperation. In the eastern woodlands, agriculture mixed with hunting and trade, and politics often balanced local autonomy with confederacies and alliances. When someone asks, "Why weren't there cities everywhere?" they are assuming one model is the default. A better question is what problems people faced where they lived and what solutions fit. Different environments produced different stable adaptive societies. Europe before 1492 is often reduced to the birthplace of exploration, but daily life still reflected a feudal order, land-based wealth, obligations between lords and peasants, strong social hierarchies. Yet Europe was changing. Monarchies in places like Spain, France, and England were strengthening, and that centralization mattered because large projects, war and overseas expansion, require state capacity, taxes, ports, legal claims, and military protection. Ships, crews, and supplies are expensive, and sustained expansion usually needs more than individual merchants. The Church remained central as well, shaping education, law, and legitimacy, even as criticism simmered and later religious conflict grew. Europe's long history of Christian-Muslim encounters, especially around the Mediterranean and in Iberia, shaped how Europeans understood rivals, trade, and religious identity. The Reconquista in Spain, ending with the conquest of Granada in 1492, shows how warfare, religion, and state-building could fuse. That context helps explain why expansion later combined economic and strategic goals with a missionary logic. Europeans were extending patterns formed through earlier conflicts and contacts. West Africa before 1492 was not an isolated source of enslaved labor waiting for Europeans. It included wealthy, organized states connected to global trade, especially trans-Saharan networks linking West African gold and other goods to North Africa and the Mediterranean. Empires like Mali are remembered for wealth and diplomacy. Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage in the 1300s signaled West Africa as a major player, not a frontier. Political centers shifted over time, but the core point holds. Complex societies with leaders who taxed, traded, negotiated, fought, and governed. This is also where precision about slavery matters. Slavery and other forms of unfree labor existed in Africa, Europe, and the Americas before 1492, but they varied widely. In parts of West Africa, slavery could be connected to warfare, debt, or household labor. In some settings, enslaved people might be incorporated into households in ways different from later plantation systems. That does not make it acceptable. It means the institution was not identical everywhere or across time. After Atlantic contact, what changes is scale and logic. Exploding labor demand made slavery increasingly commercialized, racialized, and organized for mass profit extraction, hardening into more rigid and devastating systems. Knowing the before is how you recognize what the after did to lives and to regions. Put together, these ideas give a realistic map of the world on the eve of 1492. The Americas with empires, city-states, and many other politically complex societies adapted to local environments. Europe with feudal structures alongside expanding monarchies shaped by church authority and Christian-Muslim encounters. And West Africa with organized states tied into global trade, where slavery existed but had not yet been transformed by Atlantic plantation pressures. That is the world Europeans entered, not a blank page, but a crowded room. With that crowded room in mind, the next lesson follows what happens when Atlantic routes connect these regions through European exploration and competition, including Iberian expansion and agreements like the Treaty of Tordesillas. Exploration was not one heroic adventure, it was a contest among states pursuing wealth, strategic advantage, and religious influence. The Treaty of Tordesillas can sound technical, but it reveals a mindset. Monarchies claimed they could draw lines on maps and assert authority over lands and peoples they had never seen, backed by institutions that treated conquest as something that could be legalized. It shows how quickly exploration turned into empire. As Atlantic travel became more reliable, the Columbian Exchange began. Transfers that reorganized daily life. Crops crossed oceans, reshaping diets and population growth. Animals moved, changing landscapes and labor. Precious metals moved, redirecting European economies and global trade. Diseases moved, too, turning contact into catastrophe. Smallpox and other diseases caused massive losses that were not only personal tragedies, they destabilized politics, weakened armies, disrupted food production, and made conquest easier in ways weapons alone cannot explain. If it seems puzzling how relatively small Spanish forces defeated huge empires, the answer is a combination of alliances, internal rivalries, military tactics, and biological catastrophe working together. Conquest then drove new labor systems. Europeans learned quickly that land control was not enough. Extracting wealth required labor, making labor a central site of power. Colonizers often tried to compel indigenous labor through tribute demands and systems like encomienda, reshaping existing obligations into coercive colonial structures. As native populations declined and colonial economies demanded more workers, especially for mining and plantation agriculture, Europeans increasingly turned to Africa. That accelerated the transatlantic slave trade, and the earlier context matters because this trade interacted with African politics, warfare, and commerce, empowering some groups, devastating others, and reshaping regions over time. Carry one idea forward. After 1492, the story is not Europe arrives and the world changes. Connection itself becomes a historical force, and because regions had different resources, vulnerabilities, and goals, outcomes were unequal. Some gained extraordinary wealth and power. Others faced epidemic loss, conquest, and forced labor. Still others were pulled into new trade and warfare as the Atlantic economy hardened around human captivity. Starting before 1492 prevents inevitability and forces better questions. When systems collide, who sets the rules, and what happens to people who never agreed to them? Next lesson, as you follow Iberian voyages, imperial competition, and the Columbian Exchange, look for more than ships on a map. Watch three complex worlds being tied into one, and notice when connection becomes domination and when people resist, adapt, and reshape the Atlantic world in ways Europeans did not fully control.